So, first constellation of issues that we will be talking about is the question of contraception and assisted conception. Now, it's probably fair to say that from a Protestant perspective, from a Protestant evangelical perspective, the question of contraception is likely not to be one of our big issues. Our big issue around the beginning of life is likely to be abortion. We might also think about issues concerning assisted conception to some degree. Of course, we're going to think carefully about sexuality. We are going to think about the purpose of marriage, the purpose of sexuality within marriage, moral and ethical issues surrounding sexuality outside of marriage, all these kinds of issues that we've talked about over the past couple of weeks. But it's probably safe to say that contraception won't be high on our list once we've sort of defined the questions about sexuality and the role of sexuality within marriage. But in the broader Christian context, certainly if we include the Roman Catholic Christian context, contraception remains a significant issue and a significant issue of tension and debate. So I gave you to read some of the official Roman Catholic documents, particularly a portion of the papal encyclical Humanae Vitae that came out around the time of the Vatican II conference that describes the official Catholic teaching on contraception, or at least on artificial contraception, and which remains today and has even recently been affirmed in an encyclical by Pope Francis as stating that the use of contraceptive methods aside from what's called natural family planning is considered to be improper and inappropriate and indeed even sinful. And the genesis of that position, as the textbook notes, is this natural law reasoning that ties the purpose of sexual activity within marriage to procreation. And at the very least, I think we do need to acknowledge that the tying of sexual activity within marriage to procreation in some way is part of the traditional Christian view drawn from the beginning chapters of Genesis and supported by various natural law arguments for the purpose of sexuality, and indeed for the reasoning that the appropriate role for sexuality, for sexual intercourse, is within marriage between a man and a woman. So all of that is tied together, and even in our own reasoning, even from a kind of Protestant evangelical context, thinking through these issues of sexuality, that's going to be part of our reasoning. Now, as we mentioned in our discussion of sex in general over the past couple of weeks, the earlier view in some teachers within the Christian church was that sex is only appropriate for procreation, that the kind of aspects of sex that are pleasurable and unitive are really not rightly emphasized, and that any kind of sexual activity that doesn't have as its end procreation is really inappropriate. That view has significantly changed, and even in Roman Catholic church circles, even in Humanae Vitae itself, it's recognized that the unitive aspects of sexuality are an important part of the purpose, the natural purpose of sex, just as are the procreative aspects of sexuality, and that it is not inappropriate for a married couple to engage in sexual activity without explicitly desiring to become pregnant, to bring forth children. In other words, it is appropriate to engage in sexual activity because it is pleasurable and enjoyable and is part of what unites the man and woman together in that bond of marriage. So the question really is, given that it can be appropriate to engage in sexual activity without the explicit purpose of bringing a child and, trying to become pregnant, what means are appropriate to avoid pregnancy? And the Roman Catholic position is that the only means that are really appropriate is to kind of understand the woman's cycle of fertility and to plan accordingly and to try and restrict sexual activity to times when the woman is not likely to be fertile. And there are practitioners of these methods of natural family planning who claim that they're very effective and that they're very useful and that they actually can help bind couples together. Of course, there are critics of those methods inside and outside of Catholic circles that suggest they don't really work well for everybody and that they can cause extra tension. And those debates continue. But that is the traditional Roman Catholic perspective. Now, it's really in the kind of middle part of the 20th century in which some Protestant groups start to reappraise methods of birth control, and in particular as new technologies, and remember our theme about technology and theology and ethics, as new technologies start to become available that seem to be pretty safe and pretty effective for contraception, that most Protestant groups kind of reassess this and say, well, the use of some of these methods, in particular the hormonal birth control pill or barrier methods, or other methods that don't evidently result in the destruction of the baby, of the fetus, in other words, that don't evidently result in abortions, can be appropriate and are generally left to kind of the decision and the conscience, within the community of the church, but the decision and the conscience of the husband and wife together as they try to plan out the structure of their family. Now, some of the debates, and there are some debates in Protestant circles, and in particular some debates, mostly at the margins, but some debates in evangelical circles about whether some methods really are safe and really do avoid the undesired and unintended effect of potentially destroying an embryo, a fetus, a baby that's developing. There are some who argue that the hormonal birth control pill can sometimes have the effect of making the uterus inhospitable to a fertilized egg, although the scientific and medical literature tends to suggest that that isn't really well established. I mean, it's sort of a remote possibility, but not well established. There's also some arguments to the effect that the hormonal birth control pill could have unintended negative consequences for the woman, including increased risk of cancer and things like that. But again, the literature doesn't seem to robustly really support those claims. But nevertheless, the arguments are there, and in fact, the way the hormonal birth control pill works is that it regulates or affects the woman's ovulatory cycle, so that in fact she is not producing an egg that would be available to be fertilized. So it does, work with and affect the woman's hormones. Of course, as you know, the barrier methods, condoms, diaphragms, things like that, work by blocking the sperm from reaching the egg. And then another kind of widely used method is the IUD. And there is some debate about how the IUD works, whether the IUD effectively is killing sperm cells, whether the IUD is also effectively sometimes causing a fertilized egg not to implant. And that's where the IUD can be controversial, because some argue that the IUD does in fact result in abortions, or at least in very early term failure of an egg to implant. So even within those who otherwise accept the general possibility of using forms of so-called artificial contraception, there are debates about certain methods like the IUD. Another one, of course, is the so-called morning after pill. So the morning after pill is essentially a high dose of hormonal contraception. And again, there's evidence to suggest that one way that it might work is to cause a fertilized egg not to implant in the uterus, and thereby causing arguably an abortion, or at least the destruction of that newly fertilized egg. And that's where some of the controversies, even within some ethicists or some Christians who generally accept generally available and safe methods of technological contraception, with concerns about things like the IUD or the morning after pill. We'll talk some more about those specific issues when we cover the legal aspects of all of this, but I just want to kind of give you the general framework, the general set of arguments, and the scope or range of different views among Christian theological ethicists and Christian denominations and groups that we can talk about when we meet together on that issue. So the second cluster of issues that I have up on the screen here is artificial insemination and in vitro fertilization. So this is what we would call assisted conception. So here we have circumstances in which it could be that a married couple is infertile or is having trouble with fertility. It could be that a person who is unmarried who wants to bring a child into the world might use some techniques like this. As we talked about last week, it could be that a homosexual couple might use some of these methods to bring a child into the world. And in the whole range of these, whether it is a married couple, a married heterosexual couple, a single person, a homosexual couple, there are different ethical issues and controversies and things that we need to think through and that we'll talk through in all of these areas as well. Artificial insemination, the idea here is that the woman who is producing the egg is the one who will provide the egg and bring the baby to term. But the sperm cells, will be provided in a different way. And usually we're talking here about sperm that is not from the woman's husband, but that is from some other source, and it may well come from someone the person knows, or it may come from a sperm bank where an anonymous donor has donated sperm cells, and those have been kept in stasis, have been kept frozen, and then are made available when somebody wants them. So there are a number of ethical concerns about this practice surrounding the bringing of the baby into the world, surrounding privacy of the donor, surrounding the possibility of making certain kind of selections of the kind of donor that you want, and a number of issues like that. When we're talking about in vitro fertilization, here we're talking about both the egg and the sperm outside of the woman's body in the proverbial test tube, right, in a scientific receptacle, a device, and the possibility of harvesting eggs from the woman and harvesting sperm from the man. Again, what could be the husband, it could be a donor, it could also here be an egg donor, and combining those outside of the woman and then implanting a fertilized egg in the woman, and that egg then developing and coming to term. There are other possibilities here, by the way, with both of these, which include surrogacy. So you could have a surrogate mother in which the fertilized egg is implanted, or who is supplying the egg with the husband's sperm for artificial insemination. And again, all of these raise a raft of ethical and theological issues that we'll talk through a little bit more in class. One of the main issues I want to highlight now with in vitro fertilization is the fact that in vitro fertilization inevitably results in excess embryos. It often results in embryos that fail to be viable. So, there are eggs that are fertilized that fail to be viable, and a question will arise then about whether you think that is a human life that has been intentionally created with some likelihood of it not being viable. And then it does also result in viable fertilized eggs that are never implanted. There are always excess created. And that, of course, raises issues. So what do you do with those that are not implanted and that are not intended to be used? Do you destroy them? If you destroy them, are you destroying a human life? Sometimes they're frozen and kept for later, and possibly implanted later, or often kind of remain sort of on the shelf, so to speak. There actually was a movement in some circles of Christian lawyers to try and create procedures to adopt frozen embryos to be implanted in women who would be willing to bring those to term. Very interesting and again, kind of difficult to think through all of the implications of that. But this is another one of those circumstances where, it's very sensitive, very difficult. It's likely that you have people in your congregation who are struggling with these issues, and maybe even some people in your congregation who've used in vitro fertilization to be able to conceive. And it creates a lot of difficult issues to think through.